Hi, APE students. Welcome to AP Environmental Science Video 9 on productivity and biodiversity. So when we talk about productivity of an ecosystem or biodiversity of an ecosystem, we're talking about different species and how productive those species are. So one way to measure that is gross primary production, GPP is what we'll call it from now on. This is the rate at which the producers are converting solar energy into chemical energy, which is then made into biomass. This is through photosynthesis, so that whole process of taking in oxygen and water and producing carbon dioxide and sugar. If you look at the United States, here's a map of production in the United States. Blue and green areas over here, like where we are going to be more productive. Also in California, there's a lot of productivity. But then when you head towards like the middle of the United States, you see a lot of non-productive land, and this is going to be very arid, very dry. A lot of this is sort of like a desert-ish place, so there's not as much productivity that's happening out there. When we're looking at productive ecosystems, terrestrial ones, the main ones you should know about are swamps and marshes and tropical rainforests. Those are the most productive terrestrial ecosystems. If you look in the aquatic ecosystems, estuaries are going to be the most productive. And an estuary is an area where fresh water meets salt water, so think a lake or a river draining into the ocean. These are also nursery grounds for fish because they do have so many nutrients, and they're really awesome places if you're a fish to have babies. Net primary production, also going to be called NPP from now on, is the rate at which producers are using photosynthesis to store energy minus the rate at which they are using this energy through respiration. So they're producing, everything they're producing is the gross primary productivity, but they're using some of what they're producing for the respiration process. So that net, after you subtract out R, is going to be our NPP, our net primary productivity. So what's the difference really between gross versus net? I like to think about money, as most people do. When you think about your paycheck, the amount that you actually get paid versus the amount that you actually take home are two different things. So the difference between your gross pay, which would be maybe $1,000, and then the net you take home $700 from that 1,000 because of taxes and fees and things like that. So that's going to be kind of like the respiration from the plant. It's going to be the taxes and the fees, the cost of doing the business to begin with. And then for units, our energy produced by an ecosystem per unit area per unit time, usually meters squared per year. And our energy is going to be measured in kilocalories. So our final units are kilocalories, meters squared per year. Make sure you write that down because you're going to need to be able to know those units and include them when we're actually doing calculations. So looking at biodiversity, how do we actually measure if something is diverse or not? So biodiversity is a measure of how many species there actually are in an area. We usually talk about evenness versus richness. So if it's even, like the one on the left, we see that there's lots of organisms and there's about the same number of organisms. There's lots of different organisms per species. So there's lots of red, yellow, blues, whites, and greens. Both of these samples are actually rich. Species richness just means that there's a lot of organisms, a lot of different types of species. So in both left and right, you would have the same richness. However, evenness is only going to be on the left side, whereas there's not going to be an even number of species on the right because there's lots of red, but there's not lots of green, white, blue, or yellow. So you want that richness, which you have in both of these, but you also want that evenness to call it a biodiverse area. So in these two samples, the one on the left would be the most biodiverse because not only does it have 5 different species, it has 4 members of each of those species. Whereas the right one has 5 species, but it has 1 organism for the green, yellow, blue, and white. So when we look at the Earth's biodiversity, the main thing I want you to know from this is that insects make up most of the Earth's biodiversity. There's a ton of insects. I know not everybody likes insects, but they do serve very good purposes. Even mosquitoes, sometimes that's hard to think about. We don't like mosquitoes usually, but insects serve a very good purpose, and they actually provide us with a lot of ecosystem services that we would otherwise have to pay for without them, like bees pollinating plants, for example. So why should you care about biodiversity? Well, it provides us with, here again, is our natural resources and our natural services. These things account for a lot of money. So even if you don't necessarily care that much about the environment or you don't feel that way right now, most people still care about money. So clean air and clean water are provided for us. If we don't get that provided by the trees and rivers and streams, then we have to start paying for that ourselves. And a lot of people appreciate aesthetics. They like to go out and view these things. They feel good about being outside. So that can be another reason why biodiversity is important to us. So, talking about extinction rates, unfortunately, a lot of the organisms that have been on this planet have already gone extinct. About 99% of everything that has ever lived on the planet has gone extinct. Our current rate of extinction is 100 times higher than the background rate. There's always a little bit of extinction happening, but it's at a very, very low rate. And right now, we're having a lot of organisms that are going extinct, a lot of things that we don't even know about and we'll probably never know about. And then we're projected to hit 10,000 times the background rate by the end of this century, which will mean that a fourth to half of the world's plants and animal species that are currently here are going to go extinct. Lots of those are going to go extinct without us even ever knowing about them. So when we're looking at extinction, kind of how do we get to the extinction phase? Well, we now classify things based on how endangered or vulnerable or threatened those species are. So if it's an endangered species, like you hear a lot of the times, the koala bear, for example, polar bears, things like this. These are species that are judged to be endangered with extinction. So they could go extinct very soon. And we put them on a list, the endangered species list, and usually there's a lot of protections that come with that. And we try to protect those organisms. A lot of times we'll put them into zoos and things like that to try to breed them and introduce them back into the wild. The definition of threatened is an animal or plant that is likely to become endangered in the future. So the African elephant, for example, is threatened. It's going to probably become endangered soon, mainly because of hunting and poaching, unfortunately. What are some causes of extinction? If you can remember HIPCO, that will help you remember some causes of extinction. So habitat destruction, invasive species, what we talked about in Unit 2, pollution, human population growth, climate change, and overexploitation are all things that are threatening species, mainly all human related. So we do try to conserve things. Conservation biology is trying to find ways to protect these species. So rehabilitation centers, we have a lot of zoos, things like that are geared towards conservation. And actually protecting them and breeding them and introducing them back into the wild. An example of this would be bald eagle conservation. So in 1963, there were only 417 pairs left that we knew about because of loss of habitat. They were also hunted, and DDT was killing them. So Rachel Carson figured out that DDT was causing the shells of most birds to not be very tough. So the eggs were cracking before the birds could actually hatch. On August 8th, 2007, the bald eagle was taken off of the endangered species list because of the conservation efforts that were surrounding the birds. Illegal to hunt them, things like that, and they were rehabilitated. So that was a positive conservation story. We also use seed banks. These are seeds that are frozen in kind of hidden areas for future use in case there's an emergency. And they're stored in a bunch of different locations. This is kind of the idea that, if some big tragic apocalypse, maybe the zombie apocalypse or something like that happens, we will have these seed banks so that we will be able to grow things again. And here's a actual seed bank. This one is in Norway. It's a vault that has a lot of different seeds in it. And this one is actually at risk now because of climate change. It was buried underneath a lot of ice, and now the ice is melting. And so it's kind of now you can actually see it, which used not to be the case. And now there's a lot of rainfall that's happening in this area because of climate change effects, and the rain actually leaked into the entrance of the seed vault. No seeds were actually damaged in this situation, but it is kind of a risk that we could potentially see happening to other seed vaults as well. So looking at a couple of things that led to the endangered species lists and things like that. The Endangered Species Act of 1966, you need to know this law. This kind of came about because of that issue that Rachel Carson pointed out in her book Silent Spring about DDT and the bald eagles. So the Secretary of the Interior determines what wildlife are facing extinction in the U.S. They use the U.S. Department of Fish and Wildlife Service to do research on the different species that are proposed for the listing, and then they kind of vote on it and see, should we put this animal on this endangered species list. Some international laws, there is the CITES, so Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species, was created by the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and it prohibits the trade of different species, over 900 species that are on this list that they have. So here is the different listing that the International Union for Conservation of Nature uses. LC is a designation for least concern. NT means not threatened. Vulnerable, endangered, critical. And then we have endangered in the wild, meaning that they're in captivity, like a zoo or something like that, but they can't be released because they've been bred in the zoo and they've grown up there, and they would probably be killed very easily by predators if they were released. And then there's completely extinct. And the thing about being extinct is once you are extinct, there's really no coming back from that. You cannot, make the animals come back once the last individual has died. And here are some examples of those things. The hippo is considered vulnerable, whereas the angel shark is considered critically endangered. And if you click on this link right here, the World Wildlife Service, which I'm going to actually pull up for you guys, it will take you to the species directory of the World Wildlife Fund. And essentially what it shows you are all the different animals, their scientific name, and what kind of conservation status they have. So they're critically endangered, vulnerable, extinct, those sort of things, although I don't believe they put extinct up here anymore. But near threatened, and you can kind of look and see what the different animals are. There's the African elephant that you might know of, the tigers, there's foxes, wolves, elephants. Lots of these things are going to be very high up in the food chain because usually they're the most affected by human activity. All right, that's all I have for you. Come with questions tomorrow.